René Descartes began with a single, ruthless doubt that unsettled the comfortable certainties of his era. He stripped away everything that could possibly be false until only one indubitable fact remained, and that fact announced itself in the most unusual language thinking proves existence. The phrase, "I think. Therefore I am," became more than a slogan, and it became the foundation for a new way to examine what counts as real. It would also become the hinge on which a centuries-long argument about mind and matter would swing wildly back and forth. To understand Descartes, we must first locate him inside a storm of change and invention, where compass, telescope, and skepticism reshaped reality itself. He was not merely a thinker in isolation, but a figure trying to rebuild knowledge on a foundation that could withstand the new scientific age. He wanted certainty the way an architect wants granite for a foundation, and this hunger pushed him toward methods of radical doubt that revealed the thinking self as the only impregnable refuge. That refuge would transform into an ontological claim about two fundamentally different kinds of substance in the world. Descartes' method of doubt functioned like an intellectual sifter, removing everything that could possibly be called into question by skeptical scenarios, by doubting sense perception, dreams, and even mathematical truths under the hypothetical rule of an evil demon. He forced his philosophy to rest on something that could not be doubted. That indubitable anchor was the awareness of thought itself, and from that immediate presence of thought he derived the basic certainty of his own existence. The cogito thus played the dual role of an epistemic cure and a metaphysical starting point for the rest of philosophy. When Descartes claimed that thought guaranteed existence, he opened a subtle but seismic shift in the way selfhood was imagined. Instead of identity being anchored in body, bloodlines, or social roles, it became anchored in the capacity to think and doubt. This reorientation elevated subjectivity and interior life to primary philosophical importance, changing the trajectory of how future generations would talk about knowledge, selfhood, and moral responsibility. It also quietly set the stage for a problem that would outlive almost every other debate born in those early modern years. From the cogito, Descartes derived a radical metaphysical split between res cogitans and res extensa, two fundamentally different kinds of substance in the universe. The mind, he argued, was an immaterial thinking thing, while bodies and all physical objects were extended things governed by geometry and motion. This split became known as Cartesian dualism, and it claimed to resolve the problem of how to account for both mental life and the mechanistic successes of science. Yet declaring two types of substance then begged a delicate and dangerous question about how those substances could interact. Descartes described the world of matter as a kind of great machine, predictable and lawful when understood through mathematics and physics. He praised the mechanistic explanations of motion and physiology because they seemed to unlock how bodies behaved without invoking mysterious purposes or souls. At the same time, he insisted that bodies lacked inner life and could not account for the subjective experience of thoughts, sensations, and intentions that characterize minds. This juxtaposition of machine bodies and thinking souls deepened the mystery of human nature into a metaphysical chasm. If bodies were machines and minds were immaterial, then minds could not be located in space or measured with instruments. Descartes therefore described the mind as non-extended, indivisible, and essentially private in a way the body was not. This description made minds resistant to scientific explanation, not because they were unimportant, but because they belong to a different ontological category than the measurable, extended things investigated by physics. The distinction felt elegant, but it created practical and theoretical headaches that philosophers would name the interaction problem. The interaction problem asks the blunt question: if mind and body are so different, how could they causally influence one another across their ontological divide? Descartes attempted to resolve this difficulty by proposing a tiny gland in the brain, the pineal gland, as the meeting point for mind and body. The pineal gland suggestion seemed to translate a metaphysical puzzle into a biological hypothesis, but it raised more skeptical eyebrows than it calmed, because the mechanism for influence remained unclear and unsatisfactory. In the centuries that followed, philosophers and scientists would press this problem harder, and the simple pineal gland answer would be treated as quaint at best. More difficult still was the emerging doctrine of the causal closure of the physical world, which suggested that every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause. If the physical realm is causally closed, then there is seemingly no causal room left for an immaterial mind to affect bodily events. This argument pushed Cartesian dualism into a corner, because either minds were epiphenomenal bystanders, or they somehow violated the otherwise beautifully law-like order of the physical universe. The tension between explanatory completeness in physics and the felt reality of mental causation remains philosophically combustible. Even in Descartes' own time, critics emerged who found dualism implausible and problematic on practical and moral grounds. One prominent critique came from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who bluntly asked how something immaterial could move something material without losing its immateriality in the process. Her question was not merely rhetorical, and it exposed a real explanatory gap. Dualism described two substances well, but failed to explain their bridge. That failure would haunt dualism, provoking alternatives that tried to preserve what was valuable while fixing what was broken. Rival metaphysical systems rose in response, with Spinoza and Leibniz offering monist or pre-established harmony solutions that avoided Cartesian substance dualism altogether. Spinoza proposed a single substance with different attributes, while Leibniz argued for coordinated monads whose apparent interaction was harmonized from the start. These responses attempted to preserve unity and avoid causal puzzles, yet they introduced their own oddities and metaphysical expenses that many found unpalatable. The debate thus expanded rather than resolved, revealing how sticky and deeply human the mind-body question really was. The Enlightenment and later scientific revolutions shifted the battlefield toward empirical evidence, and neuroscience gradually tightened the noose around simplistic dualist explanations. Stimulants and electrical currents reliably altered subjective experience. These empirical findings did not straightforwardly refute dualism, but they reframed the discussion by showing that any adequate account of mind would have to reckon with neural mechanisms. The more the brain revealed itself as a dynamic information processing system, the more pressure mounted on old metaphysical separations. During the 20th century, philosophers proposed several naturalistic alternatives that aimed to dissolve the Cartesian gap without denying mental reality. Identity theory suggested that mental states are identical to brain states, while behaviorism tried to replace inner talk with observable behavior as the basis of psychology. Functionalism then reframed things again by claiming that mental states are defined by their causal roles rather than their material substrate, allowing multiple realizations in different physical systems. These approaches shifted the focus from metaphysical substance to functional relations, offering new ways to think about consciousness and cognition. Despite these advances, the mind-body problem refused to vanish and instead morphed into subtler puzzles about qualia and the explanatory gap between subjective experience and objective description. Philosophers such as Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers articulated how the what it is like aspect of consciousness resists purely physical explanation. Chalmers coined the term hard problem to describe how subjective experience seems ontologically different from structural and functional accounts of the brain. This reframing brought dualist-sounding intuitions back into academic respectability, not as an endorsement of Descartes, but as a demand for explanations that join the third-person and first-person perspectives. Property dualism emerged as a compromise that accepts a single physical substance while allowing for irreducible mental properties to arise from complex systems. This view does not resurrect Cartesian souls, but it does admit that certain mental features might be ontologically distinct from physical descriptions. Another contemporary move is panpsychism, which posits that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter at some level, thereby avoiding emergence mysteriously appearing from nothing. Each of these modern positions shows how the debate has become both richer and more nuanced since Descartes first set the terms. The mind-body split also has direct consequences for how we think about free will, moral responsibility, and agency in the world. If minds are immaterial and somehow outside physical causation, then freedom might seem secure in a way mechanistic laws cannot touch. Conversely, if minds are fully grounded in neuronal processes governed by physical laws, then questions arise about whether our choices are genuinely free or merely the downstream result of deterministic mechanisms. These implications make the mind-body debate not only abstract but pragmatically urgent for ethics and law. Personal identity also bears the fingerprints of Cartesian thought, because defining who we are depends on whether we prioritize psychological continuity or bodily continuity. Descartes' emphasis on thinking highlighted memory and consciousness as core to identity, but modern thought experiments complicate this picture. Consider brain transplant or teletransportation scenarios that separate psychological content from bodily substrate. These thought experiments force us to decide which criteria truly matter for a person to remain the same. The debate thus spans metaphysics, neuroscience, and imaginative probing of future technologies. Advances in neuroscience and technology are making the mind-body conversation more concrete as neural implants, brain-computer interfaces, and AI systems begin to affect cognition, expression, and agency. These technologies test philosophical theories against practical outcomes, revealing gaps between conceptual frameworks and lived realities. For example, direct neural stimulation can alter beliefs and preferences, suggesting that mental states are at least manipulable through physical intervention. Such interventions blur the boundary Descartes drew, forcing us to rethink causal relations between biology, mind, and social responsibility. So why does the mind-body problem persist, despite centuries of argument and empirical progress? The problem endures because subjective experience resists being fully captured by third-person descriptions, and human life continually returns us to first-person perspective as the measure of reality. Moreover, the mind-body problem persists because it sits at the intersection of science, metaphysics, and human self-understanding, areas that do not easily submit to a single method or language. That hybridity ensures the debate remains live, relevant, and philosophically fertile. The Cartesian split also taught us an invaluable lesson about the costs and benefits of clear conceptual distinctions, because drawing sharp boundaries can both illuminate and obscure. Descartes' separation gave philosophers tools to think carefully about mind and matter, but it also created a rift that demanded repair. Modern approaches often seek repair by translating metaphysical claims into testable hypotheses, by refining definitions, and by embracing pluralism about explanation. This pragmatic turn illustrates a philosophical maturation that values both conceptual clarity and empirical constraint. If we return to Descartes now, centuries removed from his study, his contributions look like both bold illumination and poignant insufficiency. He transformed how we think about selfhood and reason. Yet his dualism left the scientific and philosophical communities with a problem that still refuses tidy resolution. That ongoing unresolved tension is not necessarily a failure of philosophy, but an invitation to deeper inquiry that honors both inner life and empirical reality. The mind-body problem remains a mirror showing us how much we value explanation, agency, and the mysterious fact of conscious experience. Ultimately, the mind-body problem teaches a philosophical humility about the limits of any single framework to capture the fullness of human experience. Whether you lean toward physicalism, dualism, or some hybrid, the challenge remains to connect theory with the lived phenomena of thought, feeling, and choice. We live with minds that experience joy and pain, with bodies that obey and rebel, and with technologies that will increasingly force integration between the two. That reality keeps Descartes' old question alive, urgent, and deeply relevant for our future. So here is the philosophical twist. Rather than asking which side of the divide is truer, perhaps we should ask how the divide shapes the kinds of questions we can ask. Descartes gave us a language that prized certainty and subjectivity, and we still carry that language into debates about AI, responsibility, and personhood. If our conceptual tools shape our discoveries, then how we frame the mind-body question matters immensely for how we build the future. Accepting that opens a pathway to interdisciplinary work that refuses easy answers, while aiming for explanations that respect both science and subjective experience. Descartes may not have solved the problem he created, but he forced us to take the inner life seriously in a world increasingly explained by physics. The dualism he proposed remains both a historical turning point and a live problem, because it captures something stubborn about how we experience existence. If this video gave you a new perspective on mind, body, and the questions that still bind them, consider subscribing for more deep dives that combine history, philosophy, and modern science. If this changed how you see yourself or the world, hit subscribe and join the conversation.